What if I told you that for 5 years I deliberately acted less intelligent than I actually was, allowed coworkers to mock me and treat me like I was incompetent, and smiled through countless humiliations while secretly building a fortune that would let me buy the entire company and fire every single person who had bullied me? This isn't a revenge fantasy. This is exactly what I did at Sterling Manufacturing between 2018 and 2023. And the look on their faces when they discovered the truth was worth every moment of pretending to be someone I wasn't. Watch until the end because the twist in this story will absolutely blow your mind and make you question everything you think you know about the quiet people around you. My name is Hannah Park, and this is how I went from being the office joke to becoming the owner of a $50 million company while destroying the careers of everyone who thought I was too stupid to matter. The deliberate disguise. When I started working at Sterling Manufacturing in 2018 as an administrative coordinator making $42,000 annually, I made a very calculated decision that would define the next 5 years of my life. I decided to hide my actual intelligence, education, and capabilities from everyone in the company and to present myself as a sweet but somewhat ditzy young woman who was trying her best but wasn't particularly bright or ambitious. This wasn't because I lacked confidence or was afraid of success. It was because I had a specific long-term plan that required people to dramatically underestimate me while I quietly positioned myself to take over the entire operation. You see, I had graduated from MIT with degrees in mechanical engineering and business administration, and had spent 3 years working in private equity analyzing manufacturing companies for potential acquisition. I understood Sterling Manufacturing's business better than anyone who actually worked there, and I had identified it as a severely undervalued company with massive potential if it were managed competently instead of being run into the ground by incompetent executives who had inherited their positions through family connections. My plan was simple: work at Sterling in a low-level position where nobody would pay attention to me, learn everything about the company's operations and financials, identify its weaknesses and opportunities, quietly acquire enough ownership stake to gain control, and then fire all the people who had treated me terribly while restructuring the business to realize its true potential. The workplace mockery. The culture at Sterling Manufacturing was toxic in ways that made my undercover operation both easier and more satisfying. The company was run by James Sterling III, the 45-year-old grandson of the founder who had inherited the CEO position despite having no real business skills or understanding of manufacturing operations. James had surrounded himself with equally incompetent executives who had gotten their positions through personal connections rather than merit, and who spent more time playing office politics than actually running the business. These executives and managers treated lower-level employees with open contempt and seemed to take particular pleasure in mocking anyone they perceived as weak or stupid. Because I had deliberately created a persona of being somewhat slow and confused, I became a favorite target for their cruel jokes and condescending comments. James would make fun of me during meetings by asking if I understood big words or needed simpler explanations. The VP of operations would openly question how I had gotten hired and would joke that I must have gotten the job through affirmative action rather than qualifications. Female executives were often the cruelest, perhaps because they felt threatened by younger women and wanted to establish dominance by putting others down. Marketing director Rebecca Chen would laugh at my clothing choices and would make comments about how I clearly didn't understand professional dress codes. HR director Patricia Morgan would speak to me in an exaggeratedly slow voice as if I were a child and would roll her eyes when I asked questions. Every day brought new humiliations that I had to smile through while reminding myself that this was all part of a larger plan. The secret stock accumulation. While my coworkers were busy mocking me and treating me like I was incompetent, I was executing the financial component of my plan with precision that would have impressed any Wall Street trader. Sterling Manufacturing was a privately held company, but it had hundreds of small shareholders, including former employees, descendants of original investors, and various individuals who had acquired shares over the company's 70-year history. Many of these shareholders had forgotten they even owned the stock or didn't understand its potential value and were willing to sell their shares for very little money if someone approached them with an offer. Using money I had saved from my previous private equity job, plus loans secured against my other investments, I began quietly contacting Sterling shareholders and offering to purchase their shares at prices that seemed generous to them but were actually far below what the company was truly worth. The key was to acquire shares slowly and through multiple entities so that nobody would notice a pattern or realize that one person was accumulating a significant ownership stake. I created several limited liability companies with different names and used lawyers to handle the actual transactions so my personal name never appeared on any paperwork. Over 3 years, I spent approximately $8 million acquiring shares that gave me a 35% ownership stake in Sterling Manufacturing, which was more than enough to gain control of the board of directors and force changes in company leadership. The operational knowledge. While I was accumulating stock, I was also using my position as administrative coordinator to learn absolutely everything about how Sterling Manufacturing actually operated. My job gave me access to financial records, production schedules, client contracts, supplier agreements, employee files, and countless other documents that revealed the company's real situation. What I discovered was even worse than I had expected. Sterling Manufacturing was being run into the ground by incompetent leadership that was destroying a business with incredible potential. The company had valuable patents for manufacturing processes, long-term contracts with major clients, skilled production workers, and a strong reputation in its industry. But it was losing money because executives were making terrible decisions about pricing, production efficiency, and capital investments. James Sterling and his management team were paying themselves enormous salaries and bonuses while the company's infrastructure was deteriorating and competitors were taking market share. Even worse, I discovered evidence of minor fraud and self-dealing, where executives were steering contracts to companies they had personal financial interests in and were using company resources for personal benefit. I documented everything meticulously, knowing that this information would be valuable when I eventually took control and needed to justify firing the entire leadership team. The double life strain. Living a double life where I pretended to be someone completely different from who I actually was took an enormous psychological toll that I hadn't fully anticipated when I started this plan. Every day I had to deliberately make myself seem less intelligent, less capable, and less confident than I really was. I had to ask obvious questions, pretend to be confused by simple concepts, and act grateful when people explained things to me in condescending ways. I had to dress slightly wrong and style my hair in ways that looked unprofessional to reinforce the image that I didn't quite fit in corporate environments. I had to laugh at jokes made at my expense and thank people for criticism that was actually just bullying. The strain of maintaining this act for years while being treated terribly was immense, and there were many times when I wanted to drop the facade and tell everyone exactly what I thought of them. I kept detailed journals where I could express my real feelings and thoughts without worrying about maintaining my cover. I also had a therapist I met with regularly who knew about my plan and helped me process the emotional impact of deliberately subjecting myself to workplace abuse. The therapist occasionally questioned whether the plan was worth the psychological damage, but I was absolutely convinced that the eventual payoff would make everything worthwhile. The production floor insights. One of the smartest decisions I made was spending significant time on the manufacturing floor talking with production workers and learning how the actual work was done, rather than just understanding the business from financial documents. Because executives treated me as unimportant, I could wander around the factory asking questions without anyone thinking I was gathering intelligence or planning anything significant. The production workers were incredibly knowledgeable about manufacturing processes and equipment, and they were frustrated because management ignored their suggestions for improvements and treated them with disrespect. I learned about inefficiencies in the production workflow that were costing the company millions annually, equipment that needed to be replaced or upgraded, safety issues that were being ignored, and numerous opportunities to improve quality and reduce waste. I also learned which workers were the most skilled and knowledgeable, and which ones were just coasting while collecting paychecks. This information would prove invaluable when I eventually took over and needed to restructure operations, because I already knew exactly what changes needed to be made and which people should be promoted into leadership positions. The board manipulation. As my ownership stake grew, I began carefully manipulating Sterling Manufacturing's board of directors to position myself for the eventual takeover. The board consisted of 7 members, including James Sterling, who served as chairman, 2 of his relatives who rubber-stamped whatever he wanted, 2 outside directors who were friends of the family and didn't pay much attention to company operations, and 2 seats that had been vacant for over a year because James hadn't bothered to fill them. Board meetings were formalities where James would present whatever he wanted approved, and everyone would vote yes without asking difficult questions. Using my network of shell companies and nominee shareholders, I was able to force a special shareholder meeting and vote to fill the 2 vacant board seats with individuals I had secretly recruited who understood they were working for me, even though this wasn't publicly disclosed. These 2 new board members began asking uncomfortable questions about company performance and executive compensation, which started creating tension and making James nervous about his control. I also had one of my board allies start demanding regular financial audits and reviews of executive expenses, which made it much harder for James and his team to continue their self-dealing and minor fraud. The pressure was building slowly but inexorably, and James had no idea that the person orchestrating his problems was the ditzy administrative coordinator he mocked regularly. The financial crisis trigger. In early 2023, Sterling Manufacturing faced a financial crisis that would create the perfect opportunity for my takeover. The company had been losing money for years due to mismanagement, but James and his executives had been hiding the true situation through accounting tricks and by deferring critical maintenance and investments. The situation finally reached a breaking point when a major client threatened to cancel a $20 million contract because Sterling had failed to meet quality standards and delivery schedules. At the same time, the company's bank was threatening to call loans because Sterling had violated debt covenants related to profitability and cash flow. The board was forced to hold emergency meetings to address the crisis, and James tried to get approval for additional borrowing and for selling valuable company assets to raise cash. My board allies blocked these proposals and instead demanded that James present a comprehensive turnaround plan that would actually fix the operational problems rather than just temporarily patching cash flow issues. James couldn't present a credible plan because he didn't actually understand what was wrong with the company or how to fix it. The board meetings became increasingly contentious as my allies asked detailed questions that exposed James's incompetence and the depth of Sterling's problems. The takeover moment. At a particularly contentious board meeting in March 2023, I made my move in the most dramatic fashion possible. James was attempting to get board approval for desperate measures, including laying off skilled workers, selling key equipment, and taking on expensive debt that would have destroyed what remained of the company's value. My board allies were blocking these proposals and demanding James's resignation, but James was refusing and claiming that as the majority shareholder from the Sterling family, he couldn't be removed. That's when my attorney walked into the boardroom and announced that he was representing a shareholder group that controlled 35% of Sterling Manufacturing stock and was demanding immediate changes in leadership. James was confused and angry and demanded to know who this mysterious shareholder was and why they were interfering in family business. My attorney calmly explained that his client had been accumulating Sterling stock for over 3 years through dozens of separate transactions and now controlled more shares than James and his relatives combined. When James demanded to know the identity of the shareholder, my attorney pointed at me and said that Hannah Park, who they all knew as the administrative coordinator, was actually a former private equity analyst with degrees from MIT who had been deliberately working undercover while acquiring control of the company. The expressions on everyone's faces were absolutely priceless as they realized that the woman they had been mocking and treating terribly for 5 years was actually the person who now controlled their futures. The immediate aftermath. The boardroom erupted in chaos as James and the other executives processed what they had just learned. James was screaming about fraud and deception and threatening lawsuits, claiming that I had somehow tricked people into selling me stock. My attorney calmly explained that every share purchase had been completely legal and shareholders had voluntarily sold to me at fair prices. Rebecca Chen, the marketing director, who had spent years mocking my appearance, looked like she was going to be sick as she realized the implications. Patricia Morgan from HR was stammering and trying to claim she had always treated me professionally, which was absolutely false. The 2 outside board members who were James's friends immediately tried to switch sides and curry favor with me, but I made it clear that their services would no longer be needed. I formally nominated new board members to replace James and his allies,
and my 35% ownership stake plus the votes from smaller shareholders who were fed up with James's mismanagement gave me easy majority control. Within 2 hours, I had been elected chairman of the board and had voted to terminate James Sterling as CEO effective immediately. I also voted to terminate every single executive who had participated in the toxic culture and had treated employees badly. James tried to refuse to leave and claimed that his grandfather would roll over in his grave, seeing an outsider take control of the family business. I pointed out that his grandfather had built something valuable and James had spent years destroying it through incompetence, and that I was saving the company that his mismanagement had nearly killed.
The mass terminations. Over the following week, I systematically fired every manager and executive who had been part of the toxic culture that had made Sterling Manufacturing such a miserable place to work. This included not just the senior executives, but also middle managers who had participated in bullying and creating hostile work environments. Each termination meeting was deeply satisfying, as people who had spent years treating others terribly suddenly found themselves on the receiving end of consequences. Rebecca Chen, who had mockery clothing, cried and begged for another chance, claiming she had been joking and hadn't meant anything by her comments. I told her that jokes are supposed to be funny and that she was terminated effective immediately. Patricia Morgan from HR tried to claim that I didn't have grounds to fire her and threatened legal action. I presented her with documentation of her own misconduct, including multiple complaints from employees about her discriminatory behavior that she had ignored or covered up. The VP of Operations, who had questioned how I got hired, demanded a severance package. I informed him that executives terminated for cause received nothing beyond their final paychecks. In total, I fired 23 managers and executives in the first month, and the atmosphere in the company changed dramatically as people realized that the old guard was gone and that competence and treating people with respect actually mattered now. The restructuring plan. With the toxic leadership removed, I implemented a comprehensive restructuring plan that addressed all the operational issues I had identified during my 5 years of intelligence gathering. I promoted skilled production workers who had been ignored by previous management into supervisory and management positions where their expertise could actually influence decision-making. I invested in equipment upgrades and facility improvements that previous management had deferred. I renegotiated supplier contracts and client agreements to terms that were more favorable and sustainable. I implemented new quality control and production efficiency systems based on best practices I had learned during my private equity career. Most importantly, I changed the company culture to one where employees were treated with respect and where good ideas were valued regardless of who suggested them. The results were dramatic. Within 6 months, Sterling Manufacturing had returned to profitability, client satisfaction scores had improved significantly, employee turnover had dropped by 70%, and production efficiency had increased by 40%. The company that James Sterling had been driving into bankruptcy was suddenly worth far more than I had paid to acquire control of it. The personal revelation. The most satisfying moment of the entire 5-year plan came when I called an all-company meeting to introduce myself properly and explain what had really been happening. I stood in front of hundreds of employees and told them the truth, that I had degrees from MIT, had worked in private equity, had deliberately hidden my capabilities for years while documenting how the company actually operated, had acquired control through stock purchases, and had fired everyone who had created the toxic culture. I explained that I had subjected myself to years of mockery and humiliation as part of a calculated plan to position myself to save the company and create a better workplace. The production workers who I had spent time with and who had always treated me kindly gave me a standing ovation. Several people came up afterward to thank me for removing the executives who had made their lives miserable. A few individuals who had participated in mocking me tried to apologize and claim they hadn't known better. But I told them that treating people badly is never acceptable regardless of who you think they are. I also announced significant raises for production workers and new profit-sharing programs that would allow everyone to benefit from the company's improved performance. The message was clear. Sterling Manufacturing was under new leadership that valued competence and respect over politics and family connections. The financial outcome. The financial results of my 5-year plan exceeded even my optimistic projections. I had invested approximately $8 million acquiring my initial 35% stake in Sterling Manufacturing, plus another $3 million in legal fees, carrying costs, and other expenses related to the takeover. After implementing my restructuring plan and returning the company to profitability, I received several acquisition offers from larger manufacturing companies and private equity firms that valued Sterling at over $100 million. My 35% stake was suddenly worth $35 million, which meant I had turned my $11 million investment into a $24 million profit in just over 5 years. But rather than selling immediately, I decided to acquire the remaining shares and take Sterling private as a wholly owned company that I could continue building without interference from other shareholders. This required additional financing, but banks were eager to lend against Sterling's improved performance and strong fundamentals. By the end of 2023, I owned Sterling Manufacturing completely, and the company was valued at approximately $120 million and growing. The woman who had been mocked for 5 years as too stupid to succeed was now the sole owner of a company worth over $100 million. The broader impact. My story became something of a legend in business circles, as word spread about the administrative coordinator who had secretly acquired and turned around a manufacturing company while being mocked by the people she would eventually fire. Several business publications wrote articles about my strategy and debated whether my approach was brilliant long-term thinking or unnecessarily cruel psychological warfare. Some people praised my patience and strategic planning, while others questioned the ethics of deliberately subjecting myself to workplace abuse as part of a business strategy. I defended my choices by pointing out that I hadn't created the toxic culture at Sterling Manufacturing. I had simply used it to my advantage while planning to eliminate it. The executives who mocked me had chosen to be cruel and condescending, and they faced consequences for their choices. My story also inspired discussions about how companies underestimate employees in administrative and support roles, and how the people who seem least important often see and understand more than anyone realizes. Several other individuals reached out to tell me about similar situations where they had been underestimated and had used that to their advantage, though none had executed a plan quite as elaborate as mine. The current reality. Today, Sterling Manufacturing is a thriving company with annual revenue of $80 million and strong profitability that makes it one of the most successful mid-size manufacturers in its industry. I serve as CEO and majority owner and have built a leadership team of competent professionals who share my values about treating employees with respect and making decisions based on merit rather than politics. The company culture has been completely transformed from the toxic environment that existed under James Sterling's leadership to one where people actually enjoy coming to work and feel valued for their contributions. I occasionally think about my 5 years of pretending to be someone I wasn't and wonder whether the psychological toll was worth the financial and personal rewards. The answer is complicated because while I achieved everything I set out to accomplish, the experience changed me in ways that weren't entirely positive. I learned that I'm capable of sustained deception and can endure significant psychological discomfort in pursuit of long-term goals, but I also learned that revenge, even when justified, doesn't provide the emotional satisfaction that you expect it to. The look on James Sterling's face when he realized I had outmaneuvered him was gratifying, but it didn't erase the years of humiliation I had endured to get to that moment. The most important lesson from my experience is that underestimating people is one of the most dangerous mistakes anyone can make in business or in life. James Sterling and his executives assumed that because I was young and female and worked in an administrative role, that I couldn't possibly be a threat to them. They mocked me openly and discussed confidential information in front of me because they genuinely believed I was too stupid to understand or do anything with what I was learning. Their arrogance blinded them to the reality that I was systematically documenting everything, building relationships throughout the company, and positioning myself to take everything they thought was securely theirs. The people you dismiss as unimportant might actually be the most dangerous individuals you encounter because they have access, they're watching, and they're being consistently underestimated. My story proves that patience and strategic thinking can overcome almost any power imbalance, and that sometimes the best revenge isn't confrontation, but simply waiting for the right moment to take everything from people who never saw you as a real threat. James Sterling learned too late that the administrative coordinator he mocked was actually an MIT-educated private equity professional who was smarter, more strategic, and infinitely more patient than he would ever be.
Sometimes the person everyone laughs at gets the last laugh, and when that happens, the reversal is absolutely devastating.